Bum, bum. How's it going, all my cool cats out in Xville? Boom. We got that, and we got that. Okay, so there was another source I really wanted to share while we're reading through the Summa Theologica by Aquinas. It's pretty evident if you've listened to the last few videos that Aquinas and his entire audience and everybody who he expected to be literate enough to read what he was writing all understood that the earth was round and not flat, obviously, and that he was basing all of his thoughts on an Aristotle, and that in the Aristotelian world, everybody understood that the earth was round and not flat. So, C.S. Lewis did this introduction to Renaissance literature, medieval and Renaissance literature. The book was put together by compiling a series of Oxford lectures that he had done that were so awesome they made a book out of it. Book is called The Discarded Image. One of the really cool things about this book, all right, first of all, he's making points about how the people in the past in different time periods, how they thought about themselves, about the world, about the cosmos, about the shape of the earth, all of this stuff. And then in order to back up his claims that they thought this way or that way, he just effortlessly quotes poetry that nobody's ever heard of that was written in those times. Just like, oh yeah, well, I mean, obviously they thought this way because yeah, check out this line in this poem where this guy is singing to this girl, but he says this about the earth. And it's like, okay, C.S. Lewis, where did you come from? This is awesome. He's diving in deep. So, what we're going to do is we're going to read this book. And this book is going to give us some ideas about how they thought in Aquinas's time, how they thought in Aristotle's time, one of the ways that they thought about the world. One of the cool ideas that you're going to figure out as we read this book is that there's a difference between cosmology and astrophysics. That the medievals were so sophisticated, and you might become this sophisticated yourself if you want to in our modern age of scientismism, where they could say, "Oh yeah, no, physically, mathematically, the most simplistic formulas for describing the Earth and its relative motion with other heavenly bodies would be formulas for an ellipse or an oblong spheroid or things like that." They could astrophysically comprehend that, and at the same time, they could do a subject called cosmology, where they say, what's true about my place in the cosmos? How do I relate to the heavenly bodies? How do I relate to different layers and domes of authority or spherical influence or whatever? So, in one part of their mind, and maybe we only have this right now, but it would be richer if we had both. In one part of their minds, Aristotle and Aquinas are saying, well, obviously the earth is round. I mean, you can look at poetry by Milton. You go into that center of hell in the middle of the earth and you leave and you look back and the devil's upside down and you're coming out the other side of the earth. I mean, they comprehended the physics of the way the world was and in relation to other bodies in motion in the heavens. And while they understood that physics, they also had cosmology. So there's astrophysics over here, and then there's cosmology, which is a different subject, which is a little more literary than that. And what we're going to do is we're going to read a book where that and a bunch of other really awesome things are explained to us by an author who understood medieval and Renaissance literature so well that he could effortlessly quote it. It just arose in his mind unbidden when he needed examples to illustrate the way people in medieval and Renaissance times are thinking. So this book is called The Discarded Image, and again, it comes from a series of lectures that C.S. Lewis gave at Oxford. Let's begin. I think that's pretty good. Make it bigger. I wish we could maybe we can do that. No, no good. We're gonna get this. It's looking pretty good already, but perhaps we can hide this somehow. There we go. I'm digging it. All right, my friends. Oh, before we get started, almost forgot the most important thing to do. So again, we're doing this to complement and supplement what we're doing as we read through the Summa Theologica by Aquinas. But what we're going to do here is look at the way that the medievals understood astrophysics and the way that they understood cosmology, and the fact that it didn't bother them that those were two different stories told in two different ways. They didn't think astrophysically when they were thinking about cosmology, and they didn't think cosmologically when they were thinking astrophysically. And we try to blend the two, and it might come at our impoverishment, as we'll see. Before we get started, you have to grab your cup, your mug, your glass, your tankard, your chalice, your thermos or your stein, your canteen, jug or flask, your vessel of any kind, and fill it with your favorite liquid. We're drinking water today. And join me now for the unparalleled pleasure, the dopamine hit of the day, the thing that makes everything, literally everything better. It's called the simultaneous sip, and it happens right now. Go. Ooh, chills. Did you feel the chills? That's some simultaneity. Now, remember, if you're watching on X, we upload these things to YouTube afterwards. But if you're on X, you should be able to find a link where you can join on camera here with us if you like. I'll put it in the comments of the live stream. It's in another post of mine. And if you click that, I'll notice you coming in and you'll add you to it. Okay, profess. This book is based on a course of lectures given more than once at Oxford. Some who attended it have expressed a wish that its substance might be given a bit more of a permanent form. I cannot boast it contains much which a reader could not have found out for himself if, at every hard place in the old books, he had turned to commentators, histories, encyclopedias, and other such helps. Okay, so he's got an encyclopedic knowledge of the poetry of medieval and Renaissance writers, and he's going to use that knowledge and say, look, you could find this out yourself if you want to dive in, and that's a thing you're encouraged to do. But he's going to tell us what gold he's found while he was digging in those areas. I thought the lecture's worth giving and the book worth writing because that method of discovery seemed to me and seems to some others rather unsatisfactory. Move this over here and this over here. Perfect. For one thing, we turn to the helps only when the hard passages are manifestly hard. But there are treacherous passages which will not send us to the notes. They look easy and aren't. Again, frequent researches ad hoc sadly impair receptive reading, so that sensitive people may even come to regard scholarship as a baleful thing, which is always taking you out of the literature itself. My hope was that if a tolerable, though very incomplete outfit were acquired beforehand and taken along with one, it might lead in. All right. So one of the things he's hoping that we're going to get out of this is not just that he's going to dive into the medieval poetry, the Renaissance poetry, and show us the way they thought about the cosmos and that they had multiple ways of thinking about the cosmos and other things as well. But he's going to do it in a way where we might have some equipment with us as we go and do those studies ourselves. To be always looking at the map when there's a fine prospect before you shatters the wise passiveness in which landscape ought to be enjoyed. But to consult a map before we set out has no such ill effect. Indeed, it will lead us to many prospects, including some we might never have found by following our noses. All right, fair enough. He's saying go and enjoy the darn literature, but this could add to your enjoyment and it might help you to navigate it. So we're going to have to do this as well. There are, I know, those who prefer not to go beyond the impression, however accidental, which an old work makes on the mind that brings to it a purely modern sensibility and modern conceptions, just as there are travelers who carry a resolute Englishry with them all over the continent, mix only with other English tourists, enjoy all they see for its quaintness, and have no wish to realize what those ways of life, those churches, those vineyards mean to the natives. They have their reward. I have no quarrel with people who approach the past in that spirit. I hope they will pick none with me. But I was writing for the other sort. Very poetic. Okay. So you can just read medieval poetry and just sort of like the way it feels to your modern mind, or And that's fine. He has no quarrel with you. But leave us alone if what we would like to do is actually understand what these poems meant to the people who wrote and read them and built their lives around them and found them entertaining. And to do that, we're going to have to try to figure out the way they thought about the world as revealed through those poems. All right, chapter one, the medieval situation, the likeness of unlike things. Very similar to what we've been talking about in our philosophical conversations, including the last video where Socrates was talking about likeness and unlikeness. Okay, so let's see what this tells us about the medieval man. Medieval man shared many ignorances with the savage, and some of his beliefs may suggest savage parallels to an anthropologist. But he had not usually reached these beliefs by the same route as the savage. Okay. He may have many primitive ideas, but I, I can show, says C.S. Lewis, that the route by which he got to those same ideas was different. Let's see. Savage beliefs are thought to be the spontaneous response of a human group to its environment, a response made principally by the imagination. They exemplify what some writers call pre-logical thinking. They are closely bound up with the communal life of the group. What we should describe as political, military, and agricultural operations are not easily distinguished from rituals. Ritual and belief beget and support one another. The most characteristically medieval thought does not arise in that way. Okay, so he's going to tell us about this, is what we're focused on. And he says it doesn't show up that way. Now, that's interesting. We'll have to see if he can back that up. Um, so let's keep the question alive in our minds. Sometimes, when a community is comparatively homogeneous and comparatively undisturbed over a long period, such a system of belief can continue, of course, with development long after material culture has progressed far beyond the level of savagery. It may then begin to turn into some more ethical, more philosophical, even more scientific. But there will be uninterrupted continuity between this and its savage beginnings. Something like this, it would seem, happened in Egypt. That also is unlike the history of medieval thought, okay? So he's saying the first mistake you might make is thinking the medievals just found themselves plopped down. They had no philosophical or scientific, historical, cultural artifacts that could have wreaked havoc in their mind to make them try to sort out what they think about the world. They're just directly interacting with nature and with each other and their culture as rituals that evolve. That's not what happened in medieval. It's not a appropriate way of understanding the medieval mind. Likewise, there are cultures that are undisturbed by cultural clashes, he says. Now, we don't have to accept historically that any of these categories ever applied to any group of people, by the way. We can just accept the categories and say, okay, everything is on a spectrum from these endpoints. So there's like in chemistry, you have like a pure polar bond and a pure covalent bond, but you don't really. Maybe sometimes you can have a pure covalent, but generally something is along the spectrum one way or another. And so likewise, we can just take these categories from C.S. Lewis and plot out a map. Let's do that this way right here. Whiteboard online. Let's throw that out right here. Digital free whiteboard. Where's my whiteboard? There it is. Let's go ahead and just say very simply that we have a data point here. We have a location over here. We have a location over here. And we say something like, oh, I'm not sure. Am I sharing the right screen? Yeah, I am. Okay. Primitive thinking. And then over here we have culturally evolved. It's hard enough to spell with using your mouse. Okay. And so somewhere along this spectrum here, you can say, well, probably nobody is exactly here, but maybe there are some cultures that you think they're pretty much here. But then when you consider the fact that they've had thousands of years of developing their rituals and stuff, he's still sort of defining that as on this spectrum here. But then over here, you say, okay, but you can become sophisticated enough that within the house, even if you're undisturbed, let's say undisturbed is how we define this, because we don't know what his characterization of this medieval is going to be, but he's saying it's not these two. So we could say, okay, Imagine you were isolated, but you developed philosophy and science and in-house debates and stuff, and he's thinking Egypt is maybe somewhere over here, maybe some untouched tribe, um, is over here, and then he's gonna give us some other data point for medieval because he's saying the medieval doesn't really fall on either of those points. Okay, moving on. Okay, sometimes when a community is comparatively homogeneous, okay, something like that seems to have happened in Egypt. That also is unlike the history of medieval thought. The peculiarity of the Middle Ages can be shown by two examples. Okay, he hasn't given us the definition yet, but let's look at some examples. Sometime between 1160 and 1207, an English priest called Lazaman wrote a poem called The Brute. In it, he tells us that the air is inhabited by a great many beings, some good and some bad, who will live there till the world ends. The content of this belief is not unlike things that we might find in primitive cultures or savagery or animus. You know all the types of words we can use for that. Okay, to people, nature and especially the less accessible parts of her, with spirits both friendly and hostile, is characteristic of the savage response. But Lazaman is not writing thus because he shares in any communal or spontaneous response made by the social group he lives in. Okay. So he might have a view that is similar to this type of view over here, but it isn't coming from the fact that his entire culture takes it for granted that this is how we think and we have a bunch of ceremonies and rituals around it and this is just sort of the water we swim in and so we don't even question it. Okay. The real history of the passage is quite different. He takes his account of the aerial daemons from the Norman poet Was in 1155. Was makes it from Geoffrey and Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia before 1139. Geoffrey takes it from the 2nd century Dideo Socrates of Apuleius. Apuleius is reproducing the pneumatology of Plato. Plato was modifying in the interests of ethics and monotheism the mythology he had received from his ancestors. If you go back through the many generations of those ancestors, then at last you may find, or at least conjecture, an age when that mythology was coming into existence in what we suppose to be the savage fashion. But the English poet knew nothing about that. It is further from him than he is from us. Interesting. He believes in these daemons because he has read about them in a book. Okay. So there's this literary tradition. He can trace the ideas back, but he's saying the guy who found that book and discovered it, discovered something weird and strange that his mother didn't teach him when he was growing up. That the stories he read were not like the stories about the jinn that are in the garbage pile or that fly in urns, magic urns around the air or something. So he's reading about it in a book as if he's discovering some truths that w- weren't sourced to him from the rest of his culture. Just as most of us believe in the solar system or in the anthropologists' accounts of early man, most of us, savage beliefs tend to be dissipated by literacy and by contact with other cultures. These are the very things which have created Lazaman's belief. My second example is perhaps more interesting. All right, we should actually find that poem. So let's find that poem. Why would we? Look, we're going to do what he wants to do, but we're also going to do this because aren't you curious about what this poem is? Oh, let's see here. Introduction to Lasimum Brute. Lasimum Brute, maybe free download. What is that? I don't know. I don't think that's going to work. Okay, let's try again. Let's see here. Choo, 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 choo. You know what? I'm going to find all of these citations. I'm going to leave that open and I'll find it all later and then we can come back and read it and supplement it. I won't waste your time. Okay. Sometime between a priest called Lazaman wrote a poem. Okay. Ba-dum. My second example is perhaps more interesting. In the 14th century, Pèlerinage de l'Homme by Guillaume. America's the great nation, the continent of mispronunciation. So forgive me, everybody. Uh, de Goulaville, nature personified, speaking to a character. So nature is the character personified, speaking to a character called Gracchio, says that the frontier between their respective realms is the orbit of the moon. It would be easy to suppose that this is the direct offspring of savage mythopoeia, dividing the sky into a higher region peopled with higher spirits and a lower region peopled with the lower. We're right? Okay. So we might be in Middle Earth there or whatever. Okay. The moon would be a spectacular landmark between them. Okay. Between us and the lower realm and these creatures that live beyond the moon. But in reality, the origins of this passage have very little to do with savage or even with civilized religion. By calling the superior Numen, Gracchio, the poet, has worked in something of Christianity. But this is merely a wash spread over a canvas that is not Christian, but Aristotelian. Aristotle, being interested both in biology and in astronomy, found himself faced with an obvious contrast. The characteristics the characteristic of the world we men inhabit is incessant change by birth, growth, procreation, death, and decay. And within that world, such experimental methods as had been achieved in his time could discover only an imperfect uniformity. Things happened in the same way, not perfectly nor invariably, but on the whole or for the most part. This is the Aristotelian view. But the world studied by astronomy seemed quite different. No nova had yet been observed. So far as he could find out, the celestial bodies were permanent. They neither came into existence nor passed away. And the more you studied them, the more perfectly regular their movements seemed to be. Apparently, then, the universe was divided into two regions. The lower region of change and irregularity he called nature. The upper he called sky. Thus, he can speak of nature and sky as two things. But that very changeable phenomenon, the weather, made it clear that the realm of inconstant nature extended some way above the surface of the earth. Sky must begin higher up. It seemed reasonable to suppose that regions which differed in every observable respect were also made of different stuff. Nature was made of the four elements: the earth, water, fire, and air. Air, then, and with air, nature, and with nature, inconsistency, but end before sky began. Okay, so you can see the thought process that he's illustrating here. All right, we have these concepts ourselves. Where that distinction still matters to us, right? Scientists are trying to find, grand unified theories and irrefutable laws and simple formulas that can always be right and nothing ever changes according to those things. They describe it all. And then there's like the chaos and the anything can happen sort of way of being in the world. And so there's a border between those two different realms for us. And he's saying in cosmology, not astrophysics, but cosmology, you are living in a world where there are two different realms. You have human social inconsistency and complicated economic and sociological. These things are a part of your world, but there is this other realm of the magnificent physical, perfectly performed music of the spheres, and none of that is, we'll see later, committing them to a physical belief about how those things work, although C.S. Lewis is saying that it was from observation of the sky that they said, well, the things that don't seem to change are those things that are way far away from us. So maybe they put that in that location, the source of the order is out further from us. Okay. Above the air in true sky was a different substance, what he called aether. Thus, the ether encompasses the divine bodies. But immediately below the ether and divine nature comes that which is passible, mutable, perishable, and subject to death, mortal. By the word divine, Aristotle introduces a religious element and the placing of the important frontier between sky and nature, aether and air. At the moon's orbit is a minor detail. Okay, at the moon's orbit, the fact that that's where the distinction that's a minor detail. Maybe we'll find it's further out or closer than we think. But the concept of such a frontier seems to arise far more in response to a scientific than to a religious need. This is the ultimate source of the passage in Dugoleville. Okay, so Aristotle's being scientific in his motivation. He comes up with this idea and it's being expressed by Dugoleville. So when you first read him saying, "Oh, there are creatures which dwell in the air, in the sky, in the ether, in the realm where nothing changes, and they're doomed to be there till the end of time. Maybe some are good and some are bad." You might think, "Oh, a religious person dreaming up ideas of angels and demons." But the origin of this idea didn't come from something like that. What both examples illustrate is the overwhelmingly bookish or clerkly character of medieval culture. When we speak of the Middle Ages as the ages of authority, we are usually thinking about the authority of the church, but they were the age not only of her authority, but of authorities. All right, we've been reading Aquinas. The philosopher is Aristotle when he quotes him. We've seen videos ago just how much he's swimming in the water. He's talking in the court. He's arguing with other learned and academic and scholastic people, and he's citing Aristotle, expecting them to understand every detail of how Aristotle thought. That's an authority. If their culture is regarded as a response to environment, then the elements of that in that environment to which it responded most vigorously were manuscripts. Okay, he's saying if you want to think of medieval people as just sort of like picking their belly buttons and trying to grow some crops and wondering if there's a spirit in the wind and something like that, he's saying sometimes they talk about entities in the wind, but it's not the wind underneath the moon. It's the ether beyond the moon, and it's the order and it's the order and predictability of the heavenly bodies and the things which might dwell analogously to humans in that realm and what their relationship to us and to the divine might be that would illustrate by contrast our relationship to each other, to them and to the divine. He says you don't get it if you think that they're just making up spooks behind every bush. The environment that's making them think this way are manuscripts. Okay, so let's go to here and say now we have his definition. Let's say he um imagine this. Imagine a group of 10,000 people are put on an island somewhere, and also a library with a bunch of books from ancient Egypt are put there. Mathematics books, they developed calculus in ancient Egypt, as can be demonstrated. So mathematics books, architectural books, religious books, whatever. Imagine that we put just a bunch of texts from some other culture and a bunch of people, and then those people lived for 500, 800 years, and they developed a culture and they built cathedrals or pyramids or whatever they're building and what they're doing. To look at them and say, "Oh, they just came up with a bunch of things because they were interacting with snakes and turtles and birds and they were coming up with stories about the snake spirit and the turtle spirit and the whatever." That wouldn't be a correct way of understanding how they were thinking of the cosmos because all of their ideas are coming, he says, from manuscripts. So if we were to say, scholarly. So again, it's not the same as saying, "Hey, we developed all of these manuscripts. We worked out our science and our philosophy." Okay? So over here you have people that are working out their science and their philosophy, and it's just sort of a direct emergent feature of what culturally protected their civilization and made it thrive that came from the more primitive evolved rituals surround and art, right? Their sculpture and their paintings and their architecture and their calendars and their holidays and stuff have created enough space for them to have debates and write dramas and work out a philosophy and maybe even a science. That's not this over here. Oops, I should change this so you can see the thing. We'll put it over here. So this is not what medieval culture is. All right. So the medievals, he's saying, are not over here. Likewise, they're not over here. He's saying they're not a bunch of people who are saying, hey, let's spend 10,000 years or 100,000 years slowly developing stories and songs and mythology about all of our encounters with good people and bad people and scary other tribes and bear caves and land and wind and all these things. And we'll have that sort of culture before we start developing to a point where we can debate it. He says that's not what made medieval people think what they think. And also, developing so far that they come over towards like a highly developed Egyptian type culture where they have their mathematics and their philosophy and their priestly studies and their debates between all of those groups and within house of each of those groups, but it emerged directly from an undisturbed primitive culture that predated. He says that's not where the medievals are either. He says the medievals are over here, and they are more like 200,000 people stuck on an island continent who had access to a lot of books and tried to work out what they thought about the world from that. That's an interesting theory. Okay. Every writer, if he possibly can, bases himself on an earlier writer, follows an aucteur, preferably a Latin one. This is one of the things that differentiate the period almost equally from savagery and from our modern civilization. In a savage community, you absorb your culture, in part unconscious from participation in the immemorial pattern of behavior, and in part by word of mouth from the old men of the tribe. In our own society, most knowledge depends, in the last resort, on observation. But the Middle Ages depended predominantly on books. Though literacy was, of course, far rarer then than now, reading was in one way or more important ingredient was in one way a more important ingredient to the total culture. Even though more of us reading mattered more to their culture back then. You get a guy that reads and writes something and it's gonna go viral and it's going to change the way people think and talk back then. Whereas nowadays, everybody can read, and it's polluted not only reading but also writing and also thinking," said Nietzsche. Um, okay, so to this statement, a reservation must, however, be added. Okay, so now that we've made our statement, let's pull it back a little bit and qualify it some. The Middle Ages had roots in the barbarian North and West, as well as in the Greco Roman tradition, which reached them principally through books. I have put the word barbarian in inverted commas because it might otherwise mislead. It might suggest a far greater difference in race and arts and natural capacity than really existed even in ancient times between Roman citizens and those who pressed upon the frontiers of the empire. All right. We knew that. I didn't want to say that earlier when he's using the word savage, savage, barbarian, primitive. None of these are meant to be the types of insults that people sometimes imagine they are because they're arrogant in their modern time and they think they know so much more now. But we don't actually think that when we're using these terms. Primitive means you're living more like primates. It doesn't mean you don't have really profound, deep thoughts conceptualizing yourself in the place of the universe that's built on 250,000 years of passing down stories and only remembering the interesting parts and revising and sophisticating those stories, right? We all understood that before we started. We just need a term for unmolested, direct human contact with nature and without all of this literary, historical, philosophical, or scientific influence, which sometimes benefits and sometimes doesn't, right? So there's no value judgment there with any of these words. And so we're not going to apologize for the fact that he used those words because it's clear that he doesn't mean it in any way that you might want to take offense at. Long before that empire fell, citizenship had ceased to have any connection with race. Throughout its history, its Germanic and still more its Celtic neighbors, if once conquered or allied, apparently had no reluctance to assimilate and no difficulty in assimilating its civilization. You could put them into togas and set them to learning rhetoric almost at once. They were not in the least like Hottentots, dressed up in bowler hats and pretending to be Europeans. The assimilation was real and often permanent. In a few generations, they might be producing Roman poets, juris, generals. They differed from the other members of the Greco Roman world no more than these differed from one another in shape of skull, features, complexion, or intelligence. The contribution of the barbarian, thus understanding the word, to the Middle Ages will be variously assessed according to the point of view from which we study them. So far as law and custom, so obviously from the rest of that paragraph in the beginning before I made my comment, he does have categories that he could put you in if he thought that you had a low culture, right? There are well-developed civilizations that are really evil and horrible and need to be stopped in a world war. Right? There are primitive cultures that are very sophisticated, more so than people imagine, but we still have to use the word primitive because it the qualities of the way it emerges are indicated by that word. However, there are really bad, pathetic, horrible, stupid ones, and there are really fine, wonderful, noble ones. So the value judgments go both directions on all levels of that triangle. You can go to any point on that triangle and say, hey, um, really fantastic, noble, awesome, and also oops, whatever. Can we just learn to draw on the thing? And really bad version. And you can do the same thing over here. And I have to click this every time, you know? So the value judgments are still there and available for us to make, right? But the value judgments do not come, the whole point of this is that the value judgments do not come in where you fall on this line, right? You can be anywhere on this line, anywhere on this line, anywhere on this line, and you can be great or not so great. Anyway, let's move on. So far as law and custom and the general shape of society are concerned, the barbarian elements may be the most important. The same is true in one particular way of one particular art in some countries. Nothing about a literature can be more essential than the language it uses. A language has its own personality. It implies an outlook, reveals a mental activity, and has a resonance, not quite the same as those of any other. Not only the vocabulary, heaven can never mean quite the same thing as seal, like ceiling, the dome above us. All right. So he's saying in Latin and in English, you're not really getting the same meaning. But the very shape of the syntax is sui generis. Hence, in the Germanic countries, this is one of the reasons why Garcia Marquez said he loved English so much. He says in English, you always have two words at least for everything. You have Holy Ghost and you have Holy Spirit. And both of those have very different literary and poetic and connotations and meanings. So we've got the Germanic and we've got the Latin. So Germanic countries, so this marriage between the barbarians. He's talking about the Germans and the Anglicans and the Roman Empire assimilating them and all of this. He's saying we've got two sources here, including England. So the Germanic countries, including England. The debt of the medieval and modern literatures on their barbarian origin is all pervasive. In other countries where the Celtic languages and those of the Germanic invaders were both almost completely obliterated by Latin, this situation is quite different. In Middle English literature, after every necessary allowance has been made for French and Latin influences, the French, of course, is the language that has the most borrowing in English. If you look at you can actually do a study in a day where you find every German word that was adopted into English as an English word. And you can but you can't study all of them that come from the French, because there's a lot more. Anyway, Latin influences the tone and rhythm and the very feel of every sentence is in the sense that we are now giving to the word of barbarian descent. Those who ignore the relation of English to Anglo Saxon as a merely philological fact, irrelevant to the literature, betray a shocking insensibility to the very mode in which literature exists. Okay. For the student of culture in a narrower sense, that is, of thought, sentiment, and imagination, the barbarian elements may be less important. Even for him, they are doubtless by no means negligible. Fragments of non classical paganism survive in Old Norse, Anglo Saxon, Irish, and Welsh. They are thought by most scholars to underlie a great deal of Arthurian romance. Medieval love poetry may owe something to barbarian manners, ballads, till a very late period may throw up fragments of prehistoric, if it is not perennial folklore. But we must see these things in proportion. The Old Norse and Celtic texts were and remain till modern times utterly unknown outside a very limited area. Changes in language soon made Anglo Saxon unthinkable, even in England. Elements from the Old Germanic and the Old Celtic world undoubtedly exist in the later vernaculars, but how hard we have to look for them. For one reference to Wade or Wieland, we find 50 to Hector, Aeneas, Alexander, or Caesar. For one probable relic of Celtic religion dug out of a medieval book, we meet clear and emphatic a score of references to Mars and Venus and Diana. The debt which the love poets may owe to the barbarians is shadowy and conjectural. Their debt to the classics, or even, as now appears, to the Arabians, is far more certain. It may perhaps be held. So this is again more evidence that he's saying that in support of what he's saying that this is a oops, a daisy. This is a scholarly culture. The medieval culture is explicable as people who were diving into books from a different culture that emerged maybe from a primitive into a undisturbed culturally evolved way or something like that, but it's a scholarly culture. Okay. It may perhaps be held that the barbarian legacy is not really less, but only less flaunted and more discussed. Even that, it is all the more potent for being secret. This might be true as regards the romances and ballads. We must therefore ask how far, or rather in what sense, these are characteristically medieval products. They certainly loomed larger in the 18th and 19th century picture of the Middle Ages than in reality. There was a good reason why they should. Aristo, Tasso, and Spencer, the lineal descendants of the medieval romancers, continued to be polite literature right down to the age of Hurd and Wharton. Do just keep taking notes on the side as we go of literature to look up to complement what we're doing here. I want to go to a second example here. And I just want to grab this. And I'm going to keep making notes on that. Let's continue. If I had read this ahead of time and gone through it all, I'd have them all ready to go, and that would probably be better. But let's continue. Oh, where did we leave off? Uh-huh. Okay. For one probable relic of Celtic religion dug out of a medieval book, we might make clear and emphatic more certain. It may perhaps be held that the barbarian legacy is just more secret, but even more so, that highlights the point. They certainly loomed larger in the 18th and 19th century. There was romancers. Okay. The taste for that sort of fiction was kept alive all through the metaphysical and the Augustan age. Throughout the same period, the ballad also, though often in a somewhat degraded form, had kept alive. Children heard it from their nurses. Eminent critics sometimes praised it. Thus, the medieval revival of the 18th century revived not what was quite dead. All right. Well, I mean, we've seen this in Aquinas. He's writing in the 1200s, right? So, I mean, to act as though the Renaissance revived a bunch of things that we had forgotten when all of the every baron, every king, every castle, they had paintings of Apollo and Daphne on their walls. They were reminded of how to think the proper role of politics through those stories. Um, they were swimming in this water, and he says, "You're not understanding the medieval situation the way you should. It's not like it was all dead and then suddenly we discovered it again. It was more the water we were swimming in than even our Celtic and Germanic origins." It was along this line that we worked back to medieval literature, following to its source a stream which flowed past our door. As a result, romance and ballad colored men's ideas of the Middle Ages somewhat excessively, except among scholars, they do so still. Except among scholars, they do so still. Ha ha! Popular iconography, a poster, a joke in Punch, wishing to summon up the idea of the medieval draws a knight errant with castles, distressed damsels, and dragons, Quant Souffle, in the background. For the popular impression, as often a defense can be made. There is a sense in which the romances and ballads perhaps really deserve the rank of the characteristic or representative product of the Middle Ages, more like a primitive culture deriving their cultural artifacts of themselves, right? Of the things that they have left us, these have proved the most widely and permanently pleasurable. And though things which in varying degrees resemble them can be found elsewhere, they are in their total effect unique and irreplaceable. But if by calling them characteristic, we mean that the sort of imagination they embody was the principal or even the very frequent occupation of medieval men, we shall be mistaken. The eerie quality of some ballads and the hard, laconic pathos of others, the mystery, the sense of the illimitable, the elusive reticence of the best romances. These things stand apart from the habitual medieval taste. In some of the greatest medieval literature, they are wholly lacking. In the hymns, in Chaucer, in Villon, Dante can take us through all the regions of the dead without ever once giving us the frisson we get from the wife of Usher's well or the Chapel Perilous. It looks as if the romances in such ballads were in the Middle Ages, as they have remained ever since. Truancies, refreshments, things that can live only on the margin of the mind, things whose very charm depends on their not being of the center, a locality with a locality which matched with I'm sorry, a locality which Matthew Arnold possibly overvalued. At his most characteristic, medieval man was not a dreamer nor a wanderer. He was an organizer, a codifier, a builder of systems. We've seen how well built the Aristotelian system is, and we see how well adhering to the blueprints Aquinas was, as we've read through the first two questions of the first two treatises in these classes, right? So this is class 9, class 8, and 7. We did some supplements, but the first 6 videos we're just reading through the Summa Theologica, and you can see exactly what he's talking about. Builders of systems. He wanted a place for everything and everything in the right place. Distinction, definition, tabulation were his delight. Though full of turbulent activities, he was equally full of the impulse to formalize them. War was, in intention, formalized by the art of heraldry and the rules of chivalry. Sexual passion, in intention, by an elaborate code of love. Hi, all right. So you look at the knight Aaron, and he swoops up to grab the lady's handkerchief and return to her, and like he says, okay, you see this flight of fancy and romance, and it's all so uh, chaotic and epic and passionate. And he says, no, it's a bunch of rules for what counts as a legitimate way to express interest in one another. You had to do a lot of work in order for you not to be condemned as just some sort of lustful lush or something like that. So he's saying, open your eyes. These are people who are scholastic and systematic and codifying and organizing things and making a bunch of structures for them. And they're doing it through the reading of texts that didn't come from their particular culture, but were adopted by them in a biological okay, what's the right word? They're not autochthonous. Okay, they're growing up from another land and then being imported and then being studied as the center of what matters. Okay, highly original and soaring philosophical speculation squeezes itself into a rigid dialectical pattern copied from Aristotle. Studies, which was really just the fact that his books came to them in the notes of students, and for that matter. Studies like law and moral theology, which demand the ordering of very diverse particulars, especially flourish. Every way in which a poet can be, including some in which he had much better not, is classified in the arts of rhetoric. Okay, we've got categories for these things. There was nothing which medieval people liked better or did better than sorting out and tidying up. Of all our modern inventions, I suspect that they would most have admired the card index. He's trying to help us get into the minds of medievals and Renaissance persons. This impulse is equally at work in what seems to us their silliest pedantries and in their most sublime achievements. In the latter, we see the tranquil, indefatigable, exultant energy of passionately systemic minds bringing huge masses of heterogeneous material into unity. The perfect examples are the Summa of Aquinas and Dante's Divine Comedy, as unified and ordered as the Parthenon or the Oedipus Rex, as crowded and varied as a London terminus on a bank holiday. All right, he's saying, look, you're taking pandemonium, everything in the cosmos. You're saying, wow, it's so rich. He says, no, no, no. You're abolishing it. You're setting up a castle on an Apollonian mountain instead and putting everything in its proper chamber. It's not just a beehive where everything's running around. He says that's their main effect is to organize and put categories to these things. Okay. But there is a third work which we can, I think, set beside these two. This is the medieval synthesis itself, the whole organization of their theology, science, and history into a single, complex, harmonious mental model of the universe. The building of this model is conditioned by two factors I have already mentioned. One, the essentially bookish character of their culture, and two, their intense love of system. They are bookish. He didn't even tell us what it was, so we'll see in a moment. They are bookish. They are indeed very credulous of books. They find it hard to believe that anything an old aucteur has said is simply untrue. And they inherit a very heterogeneous collection of books. Now, this is a very interesting way to read, and it's a tool that you can use in our studies and in your own studies. This is, I've never talked about this before, so buckle up. The way, what's the right word for this? The way a child who's raised in a religious household reads the Bible as if the words are spoken by God is a way that you can adopt reading texts from pre-Socratics or medievals or any other era, whether they're talking about science in a different way than you do. You can just adopt it if you learn how to read that way. Now, that doesn't mean for the rest of your life you take it as gospel truth and you say it must be the case because I read it once. C.S. Lewis is saying, actually, that was basically the habit of most medieval people. It's like they read something in a book. It was almost impossible for them to imagine it wasn't true. It ended up on a page, and the page ended up here, and it was written down by some great ancient person. And so it would be hard to not think it was true for them. But what you can do is you can adopt, like when you read a novel, you suspend your disbelief, right? You just get into the world of the novelist when you're reading the novel. It's, highly powerful. This is one of the most powerful academic tricks that you can do, is read a textbook, read a law book, read an ancient book, read a modern book, a contemporary book, read any book, and have that way of reading in your mind at the same time. You can also have another voice in your head, which is being critical of it or placing it in categories in relationship to other systems of thought. But reading it as if it could be the gospel truth is one of the ways that you can read it while you're reading it in other ways as well, which will help you to actually see what the author was getting at and not make really foolish mistakes. It's a way of making yourself timeless. It's a way of removing the projection blinders from your particular cultural era and saying, okay, if I can What if this was the only book I ever read and it was handed to me by an elder and I was a small child, very impressionable, and I read it as if it had the gospel truth in it? Again, you don't wanna be an idiot and actually walk around and just believe that until you read the next book. I'm not advocating that, obviously. I'm saying if you wanna use your intellect to understand these texts, it's a very, very powerful tool that you should use, and I've never talked about it in any other context, so we'll throw it out there now. But then we'll skip back to what C.S. Lewis is saying here and say, okay, he's saying that's the way the medievals are dealing with any text that they find, and the texts that they find are from the ancients. So they are indeed very credulous of books. They're just inclined to believe. They find it hard to believe that anything an old auteur has said is simply untrue. It's got to be true to some degree. I mean, come on, it was written down. And they inherit a very heterogeneous collection of books. They have Judaic, pagan, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoical, primitive Christian, patristic. Okay, wow. We have a scholarly culture that wants to organize and make sense of everything, and it's doing it in this academic way, in this scholastic way, in this studious way, and this is the culture you would get if on that original island you put 250,000 people, but you gave them 8 libraries. 8 libraries, all the writings of a bunch of of all of these different types of sources here. Okay, that's pretty cool. Let's keep going. C.S. Lewis is getting me all hot and bothered to start reading some poetry by these people and see how they thought. Or by a different classification, chronicles, epic poems, sermons, visions, philosophical treatises, satires. Obviously, their auteurs will contradict one another. They will seem to do so even more often if you ignore the distinction of kinds and take your science impartially from the poets and philosophers. And this, the medievals very often did, in fact, though they would have been well able to point out a theory that poets feigned. If, under these conditions, one has also a great reluctance flatly to disbelieve anything in a book, then here there is obviously both an urgent need and a glorious opportunity for sorting out and tidying up. So, this is his explanation for why they seem to be so obsessed with those things. That's kind of cool. He says, look, what else are you going to do? The first thing you're going to do on that island when all of your knowledge doesn't come from your own particular culture. Okay. So, you got to think the 250,000 people are put on this island continent and they're given 8 different libraries, but they're also have their minds erased or they're there at the age of 7 with very little cultural influence from anybody else. And now they've got to make sense of the world and they've got to make sense of the world while they believe that those books all have truth in them. And how are we going to do that? So we better get really interested in organizing and sorting and classifying and making distinctions and saying, well, there's 4 different ways that you can think of a cause of something, and there's this type and this type and this type and this type. And when you're considering this type of cause, there's 3 different ways in which that can be analyzed, and there's 2 different ways that this type of a scientific inquiry could be superior to another type of a scientific inquiry that comes into the same category of the 3 categories that there are. We've seen all of that in Aquinas already, and and C.S. Lewis is saying, "I know why they did that. What else are you going to do? You're inclined to believe things that are written. You have sources of writing that are varied and different and contradict each other. What else are you going to do? You're trying to make sense of it all." Okay, all the apparent contradictions must be harmonized. A model must be built, which will get everything in without a clash. And it can do this only by becoming intricate, by mediating its unity through a great and finely ordered multiplicity. This task, I believe, the medievals would in any case have undertaken. But they had a further inducement in the fact that it had already begun and indeed carried a fair way. In the last age of antiquity, many writers, some of them will meet us in the last chapter, were perhaps half consciously gathering together and harmonizing views of very different origin, building a syncretistic model, not only out of the Platonic, Aristotelian, and Stoical, but out of the pagan and Christian elements. This model, the middle, this model, the Middle Ages adopted and perfected. Okay, so he's saying, okay, not only are they doing that, But their main source, the one that they care the most about, seems to be this ancient thing. It turns out every ancient look, let's just say this. We will have chances to read Plutarch in other classes, but one of the things that you find out about every ancient guru, lawmaker, philosopher, orator is that there's a story that they traveled to Egypt and they traveled to China and they traveled the world and they came back with all sorts of different ideas. And then they had to coalesce all those ideas and make sense of them and put it together. So not only are the medievals doing that because they have these 8 or 9 different sources of literary information they are inclined to regard as true. But the main one that they care the most about was preoccupied with doing the exact same thing. Whoa, we've got like a pyramid peak of a pyramid peak on that level of analysis. Okay, according to him, that's sort of what he's pointing out here. Okay. In speaking of the perfected model as a work to be set beside the Summa and the Comedy, I meant that it is capable of giving a similar satisfaction to the mind and for some of the same reasons. Like them, it is vast in scale, but limited and intelligible. Its sublimity is not the sort that depends on anything vague or obscure. Very hard terms and solid ideas, right? Aquinas is saying things move. And in order to move, every object we can observe in a scientific way that we can put in an explanatory, descriptive, formulaic, causal nexus has to have a sufficient cause for it moving contained within the body that bumped into it to make it move. And and that's all we have. And from that, what can we know about the origin of all this motion? And okay, so it's not vague and obscure. It is, I shall try to show later, a classical rather than a Gothic sublimity. Its contents, however rich and various, are in harmony. So he thinks they succeeded to a great degree of doing this thing, which probably is the only way that you could have evidence that they were doing it at all. We see how everything links up with everything else at one, not in flat equality, but in a hierarchical ladder. It might be supposed that this beauty of the model to us was apparent chiefly to us who, no longer accepting it as true, are free to regard it or reduced to regarding it as if it were a work of art. Okay, we can notice this. They might have been fish swimming in water, not even noticing what they were doing. But since we don't regard their views as true anymore, we get to look at the whole artifice, the whole structure of what they've done, and notice the architectural features of their intellectual constructs and say, "Oh, wow, they're quite all about categorizing and distinguishing and organizing and then harmonizing a bunch of very varied sources as if they're all necessary to be a part of the great harmony of it all." But I believe this is not so. I think there's abundant evidence that it gave profound satisfaction while it was still believed in. I hope to persuade the reader. All right, so we think of it as true, so we can notice that. But he thinks maybe there's a lot of truth in these medieval ways of thinking. I hope to persuade the reader not only that this model of the universe is a supreme medieval work of art, but that it is, in a sense, the central work, that in which most particular works are embedded, to which they constantly referred, from which they drew a great deal of their strength. Okay, I think he's saying that just of those two works, but supreme medieval work, there's sense. Okay. Chapter 2, Reservations. I do not exercise myself in great matters, which are too high for me. Psalm 131. To describe the imagined universe, which is usually presupposed in medieval literature and art, is not the same thing as writing a general history of medieval science and philosophy. The Middle Ages, like most ages, were full of change and controversy. Okay, so he wants in this book, in this series of lectures, to give us an idea of how the average poet, philosopher, scientist, reader, literate man in medieval culture saw the cosmos. But that's not the same as studying their science or their poetry as if I just want to show how it was structured. He's actually trying to say, okay, but how did all of those ideas affect the way they actually thought? Slightly different question. The Middle Ages, like most ages, were full of change and controversy. He has to do both in order to do the second, of course. Were full of change and controversy. Schools of thought rose, contended, and fell. My account of what I call the medieval model ignores all of this, ignores even the great change from a predominantly Platonic to a predominantly Aristotelian outlook and the direct conflict between nominalists and realists. It does so because these things, however important for the historian of thought, have hardly any effect on the literary level. Okay. You can look at the history and development of the science and say, oh, at this point in medieval history, everybody is saying this. And at this point, the Aristotelian has triumphed over the Platonic school. And now they're all saying this. Okay. But the mind that lives in that culture that writes poetry is drawing from both and from the tension between the two and the historical development. And that's not the same as saying, well, now they all thought this. It does not it does so because these things, however important for the historian of thought, have hardly any effect on the literary level. Remember, this book is about understanding and being introduced to medieval and Renaissance literature. The model as regards those elements in it which poets and artists could utilize remained stable. Again, which means what? It means that you might be at a point where the Aristotelian is dominant as far as the conclusions of what's taught and what's studied and what people believe in a scholastic sense, right? In an academic setting, in a court or something like that. But it also means that the everyday person and the well-learned person are being spoken to. They're vibrating to the poetry that's being written by people who are not just saying the Aristotelian. They're drawing on all these sources and on the organization and attempt to harmonize them all, right? So the poem wouldn't be there, wouldn't be written, wouldn't have caught on, wouldn't have been important, and wouldn't have been canonized if it wasn't speaking to the people, and he wants to know the mindset of the people in this culture. He's anthropologically examining that. Okay. Again, the reader will find that I freely illustrate features of the model, which I call medieval, from authors who wrote after the close of the Middle Ages, from Spencer, Donne, and Milton. I do so because at many points the old model still underlies their work. It was not totally and confidently abandoned till the end of the 17th century. In every period, the model of the universe, which is accepted by the great thinkers, helps to provide what we may call a backcloth for the arts. But this backcloth is highly selective. It takes over from the total model only what is intelligible to a layman and only what makes sense, what makes some appeal to imagination and emotion. All right. So there's this cool literary filter. This is a really, really interesting. Okay. So let's look at two subjects and examine a little bit about how they're related, and then let's look at the two that he's talking about and examine how they're related. A historian, all right, so let's just start with history and literature, okay? A historian is not a chronologist. Okay, a historian is not saying on Tuesday at 9 p.m. the king called for his supper, and at on Tuesday at 9:36 p.m. he asked to be read from the records of the kingdom whilst he was cleaning up from his or having his supper cleaned up. It's like it's not just fact, 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 fact put with timestamps on it. That's not history. History is telling a story. It's saying there were people like this. There was a guy like this. There was a challenge to the culture like this, and this was how these people set out to try to overcome that difficulty, right? There's a point A and a point B, and the character Alexander the Great is going from here to here, and Lycurgus is writing these laws because there were these people that required laws, and so he's going on a journey through these places to get the information he needs to be able to do this, and this is what makes him a great hero and someone to emulate, and none of it is being said propositionally like fact, fact, fact. However, it's a story. However, the empirical requirement for a historical story is that you present us with some amount of evidence that suggests that the story you're telling us is a story that actually happened. That's what history is. So history is just literature with an empirical requirement put upon it. So it's a science, but it's literature, right? It's telling stories. And if you decide that you wanna tell a story out of your imagination and not be burdened by the idea that you'd have to provide some evidence that this particular thing happened with actual people in an actual time and place, then you're a novelist, okay? So there's a relationship between those 2. Now let's go and see what he's doing here. He's saying, if you wanna understand a culture and the way that a civilization is thinking, you can look at their scientific models of the cosmos. You can look at how much they appreciate those models. You can look at how much they care about physics and how much they've developed physics. You can look at how much they care about law and how intricately, slightly divided and sophisticated their legal concepts are. You can look at how often there are cases in law to see how much that even mattered to them or was important to matter to them. Um, okay, you can look at all of those things. But what you could also do, C.S. Lewis says, is look at their poetry. You could look at their literature and you could say, this poet wrote this line expecting the average layman to understand what he was saying and to have it resonate with him as meaningful, have it touch his emotions. How does C.S. Lewis put it here? Uh, appeal to imagination and emotion. It had to be intelligible and it had to appeal to those things. And you can say, okay, look, you can say, well, if you were in 1492 and you went to go study law or physics or something like that, the textbook that they would use would say this, and this. But of course, we know that sometimes students ask questions and say, I don't think I like that idea. And they debate with each other. And the entire subject is made of debate and the whole thing is evolving. So you don't just take the timestamp of this textbook is what's taught. And we also know that you get taught one thing and then you get told next year, well, actually, it's not that simple. And so here's the counter principle. And right. So you don't just take it and say, this is their developed idea and they all thought this. Instead, it's a living conversation and one of the filters, one of the subjects you could use if you wanna understand a people and the way they think, pardon me, so that you might also understand and appreciate their literature if you wanted to appreciate it the way they appreciated it and come to appreciate how they might have appreciated it and maybe get new better insights than just coming from your culture and reading it and seeing if it has any effect on you alone, would be to study their literature. And say, okay, there's a both a there's a causal and an effectual. Like this is both cause and effect and indication. It signifies or it points to the fact that these are the ideas that work in their minds that they still feel are appealing and that are a good metaphor. Like, let's say I want to use this metaphor to illustrate in a story. Well, it worked. Why? It's very Platonic. We're studying Aristotle now. Well, yeah, but it worked. So if it worked and the story sticks around, we're not so Aristotelian as you might think we are if all we do is go to the highest authority and say, what does he think is the most important thing? It's kind of a cool idea. So there's lots of reasons to study literature, but there's an anthropological reason that is more historic that C.S. Lewis is pointing out here. Okay, the medieval backcloth contains hold on, we're not going to skip a single line. It takes over from the total model only what is intelligible to the layman and only what makes some appeal to imagination and emotion. Thus, our own backcloth, now for studying other cultures, we can look back at ourselves and see how we're thinking as well. This might give us some liberation and might be a means of ninja walking through a wall to climb up to some liberation and to become more timeless ourselves as thinkers. Our own backcloth contains plenty of Freud and a little of Einstein. The medieval backcloth contains the order and influences of the planets. Okay, let's look at this. It's so obvious what he's saying, and it's so obviously true. But let's just look at the 1980s. People watched a show called Bonanza. I'm not sure if it was on in the 80s or 70s or whatever, but people would watch a show called Bonanza. And in Bonanza, there's the Ponderosa. And they would be told a story, and the story was meaningful to them. One of the episodes might be about a doppelganger. There's a guy that looks just like the main character, and he's coming into town, and he's a very evil person with bad ideas, and now people are blaming you, and your reputation's on the line. It's like, okay, why would that resonate with you? Are there doppelgangers walking around all the time? Maybe. This person is using a Freudian concept of suppressed whatever, unconscious ideas. I mean, if you look at certain eras of television, it's like every single episode is just relying on somebody's partial understanding of a Freudian concept. But you could look at that art and you could say the layman resonated with this. And so even if a person at that time who really understood Freud might have understood it differently, in general, this is culturally how people are thinking at the time, which is what C.S. Lewis is after when he's studying medieval poetry and Renaissance poetry. He wants to know how they thought. All right. Um, oh, you've lost your memory, and that it's like there's move. Okay, well, that story can only work if the ideas of the layman are are partaking of the folk version of the understanding of those concepts, and they permeate. And that would be what would make it popular by definition. Okay, the medieval backcloth contains the order and of influences of the planets, but not much about epicycles and eccentricities. Nor does the backcloth always respond very quickly to great changes in the scientific and philosophical level. Okay, so it's slow to change. Great. Furthermore, and apart from actual omissions in the backcloth version of the model, there will usually be a difference of another kind. We may call it a difference of status. Great masters who do not take any model quite so seriously as the rest of us, they know that it is, after all, only a model, possibly replaceable. It's almost like I just said all those things, so we won't repeat what he's saying now. Okay. The business of so there's he's made a second distinction between the sophisticated, well-learned person who understands the Aristotelian concepts when Aquinas is saying them, and what appeals to the average person who also is swimming in that same water and trying to make sense of the world from ideas that are coming from books, that especially the Aristotelian, but who understands them in a different way, and who maybe takes them more like doctrine, the way children do, versus the way a sophisticated adult says, well, this is how we're making sense of it right now. And there's some things that maybe need revision and maybe counter principles have to be incorporated. We're on the cutting edge of all of that. So all three of those distinctions have been recognized by C.S. Lewis here as he starts to equip us to set off on this journey of figuring out how the medievals thought through the study of their poetry. The business of the natural philosopher is to construct theories which will save appearances. Most of us first meet this expression in Paradise Lost, and most of us perhaps originally misunderstood it. Milton is translating this bunch of Greek. If Elena sees this and wants to click on the join, she can come in and teach us how to pronounce these things. First used, so far as we know, by Simplicius in his commentary on the Aristotelian De Cielo or De Caelo. The ceiling is that the sky, the ceiling? I don't know. A scientific theory must save or preserve the appearances, the phenomena it deals with, in the sense of getting them all in. Okay. This is this concept. So if you're reading Paradise Lost and you see the phrase save appearances, the concept, what it meant to the people, what it meant to Milton, what it meant to the people reading Milton was your theory better take into account every observable fact. So while you sit here thinking I'm so scientific and not so woo as those medieval dark ages people, which you're completely wrong about, while you sit there and think of yourself as I've got an iPad and a jet and somebody went to the moon, so we must have more science than they do. These people, down to the layman, are comprehending the concept that if you have a theory, it better not be willfully blind to something that doesn't fit the theory very well. The better explanation has to take into account all of the appearances, the things that appear, the things that come to us through our senses, right? So C.S. Lewis is demonstrating these words might mean one thing to you, but they meant something almost the opposite to the people who wrote and read them. And so if you're judging the way they were based off of that, or if you think to yourself that you're more scientific than they were, you might be wrong in this particular case. The phenomena. They have to be saved. Do not disregard. Do not discard any of them. They all have to be saved. Your theory has to give an explanation for all of them. Otherwise, throw it out, crumple it up and bin it, and start over again, Mr. Scientist, Mr. Philosopher, Mr. Naturalist, Mr. Poet, whoever we're using in the medieval, whichever one, and we're using all of them, theologian, start again. Your theory of God doesn't take into account this natural phenomenon over here. That thing directly contradicts your theory. Your theories have to save appearances. We use the phrase save appearances very differently now, maybe. It deals with in the sense of getting or but if we study C.S. Lewis and we study the medievals, we might start using language in a more sophisticated manner as well. Oh, I forgot. I'm so sorry. There we go. This is what we're reading here. The business of the natural philosophers to construct theories which save appearances. We saw this in Paradise Lost. Usually that's where we come to it. Milton translates this phrase from the ancient Greek when he uses the phrase save appearances. Aristotelian Dikaios, this is being summarized here. Maybe that's yeah, okay. A scientific theory must save or preserve appearances, the phenomena it deals with, in the sense of getting them all in, doing justice to them. Thus, for example, your phenomena are luminous points in the night sky which exhibit such and such movements in relation to one another and in relation to an observer at a particular point or various chosen points on the surface of the earth. Your astronomical theory will be a supposal such that if it were true, the apparent motions from the points from the point and points of observation would be those you have actually observed. So if you think that you're scientific and they weren't, this is how they thought. And they thought it down to the level of the layman understanding the poetry of the poet who is referencing this notion. Okay. It's not just some weird guy in a castle who happened to be thinking like Galileo, and then we found it one day, but it had nothing else to do with the cultural development of the medievals. It's a poet who's writing this way. And he's writing, citing the very text that this civilization is basing in an almost biblical, scriptural kind of an authority sense, basing its civilization on trying to organize and incorporate into a singular model of the cosmos, of a way of thinking about the world. He's making his points pretty well here, I think. Your astronomical theory is got to the theory will then have got in or saved the appearances. But we demanded no more than that from a theory. Science would be impossible, for a lively, inventive faculty could devise a good many different supposals, which would equally save the phenomena. We have therefore had we have therefore had to supplement the canon of saving the phenomena by another canon. And here it comes. I was about to say it. First, perhaps formulated with full clarity by Occam. Okay, so the first thing is whatever theory you have for me of the universe, it better not be blind. If I can find one thing that doesn't make sense and isn't predicted by that theory, to hell with your theory. That's the way the medievals are thinking about this. Now, the problem is it doesn't actually take much effort to come up with a plethora of theories that take into account absolutely everything. So we're going to have to do some philosophical work to decide which of the theories we would prefer to other ones. And of course, we have a razor. We have the barber, Occam. He's got his razor. And we're going to say, let's use the simplest one, the one that uses the simplest terms to describe the widest amount of the diverse phenomena. Let's use the one that doesn't multiply entities for no reason, that type of thing. Now, there's nothing you've discovered in science that would tell you that that's the case. All right, I'm going to make a side point now because we're all very familiar with this idea and we're all fine with it. People cite Occam's razor all the time and they say, look, if you want to explain to me where lightning comes from, don't posit to me a bunch of electron fairies that have a court and make judgments. And when they all vote aye on something, that's when enough of the yeses come together to allow for the flow of the electrons. Like, stop. You're making up a lot of extra stuff. I can just use proton and electron. I can use positive and negative charge. I don't need other things added on top of that. But there's something I have to tell you, which you might need to know in the next 100 years at some point. And that's this. You're trying to invent AI. You haven't done it yet, but you're going to probably at some point. It might be that you end up with a super intelligence. It might be that that super intelligence can be fed every bit of data of all phenomena that we've ever experienced and make models to make sense of it. It might be that it can make thousands of models that make sense of it. And it might be that all of the models that make sense of everything are beyond any human being's ability to understand in their lifetime, no matter how simple they are. It's possible. That you could ask the AI agent, say, use this model, and I'll give you some data points, and you tell me the blah, blah, blah answer to the scientific question I asked. And he's like, oh, well, that's easy. Blah, 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 and here's your answer. And it's always right. And it always matches. But then there's this other AI agent that's using a different model, and it also gives us the right answer every time. If we were to live in that world, and I'm not saying we're going to, and we certainly don't live in it now, but if we were going to live in that world one day, of what use is Occam's razor? The complexity of all the theories is beyond any individual to analyze in the first place. Should we use Occam's razor any longer? Maybe when we're programming the AI to say, use up less energy and use up less time and get me the answer, whatever. Yeah, maybe. But maybe all of the particular questions that can even be formulated by a human being are so readily answerable by this super intelligent AI, which again does not exist and might never exist. And I'm not saying anything about those claims right now. I'm saying in a science fiction literary kind of way, imagine a world coming soon where that happens. Then we might say to ourselves, I wish I had an aesthetic razor. Maybe I'll choose the theory which, when it's described to me, matches best the mythopoetry that founded my culture, or the mythopoetry that has the most in common with all the successful human cultures, because we believe there's something natural about our evolutionary subconscious development in our interactions with the world through bloody eons of, like, we were intimately close to the consequences of hitting up against the world, and since we dreamt up certain figures and certain images and they have certain similarities, maybe I'll go with the one that sounds the most like that because it has a little bit more evidence for it. It's a very weak form of evidence. You wouldn't want to build something off of that scientifically, perhaps. But if you have a plethora of explanations that explain everything, you might need Occam's blow dryer or his razor. No, not Occam's razor, an aesthetic blow dryer or an aesthetic hair clipper or something like that. Different tool than Occam's razor for deciding which theory to go with. All right, enough of giving you a zoom into the future, things that you might consider. At this point, we're saying, hey, I'm not sure my theory explains all of the phenomena. So let's get rid of all the ones that don't explain the phenomena. Great, but we're still left with more than one. Fine. Then let's use Occam's razor. And according to this second canon, we must accept provincially not any theory which saves the phenomena, but that theory which does so with the fewest possible assumptions. Thus, the two theories, A, that the bad bits in Shakespeare were all put in by adapters, and B, that Shakespeare wrote them when he was not at his best, will equally save the appearances. But we already know that there was such a person as Shakespeare, and that writers are not always at their best. If scholarship hopes ever to achieve the steady progression of the sciences, we must therefore provisionally, Occam's razor doesn't tell you what's absolutely true here. And the first razor, the first thing that says save appearances, that just tells you what's not true so that you can disregard it. But if you have multiple things that pass that sieve test, Occam's razor doesn't tell you this one's true and this one's not. We're using Occam's razor. It's a useful tool, but it's not actually telling us which one is true. That's what I'm trying to point out with my mythical story about the near future. Um, so since it's not actually telling us what's true, why are we using it? Well, we're using it to say, let's provisionally accept the one that uses the fewest terms and doesn't posit entities without cause, right? It's easier to just believe Shakespeare had a bad day than to believe, hey, there's this other guy named Frank Spear Shake. And Frank Spear Shake came in and edited Shakespeare's. I don't have any evidence for it, but that would explain why this text doesn't look as good as this other text. Okay, but unless you find some evidence that there was a Frank Spear Shake out there that was messing around and meddling around with Shakespeare's writings, you're only positing it based off the evidence that some of the text doesn't look as impressive as some of the other text. And there's an easier explanation that doesn't require you to posit another entity, which is Shakespeare was having an off day that day. Writers do that. So why are you making up more stuff? But here's the weird part. Occam's razor tells us accept the second theory provisionally, but it doesn't tell us that there wasn't a Frank Spearshake. There could have been a Frank Spearshake out there who was doing exactly that, and you might need to just stumble across the evidence one day. And when you stumble across that evidence, now we're in a different situation because the Shakespeare had a bad day theory doesn't explain all of the evidence anymore once you found other evidence for Frank Spearshake. See how that works? The first test is take into account all the evidence. The second test is, okay, shoot, we've got too many theories that take into account all the evidence. What are we going to do? Pick the simplest one that explains the most without positing extra entities, is what Occam says. And for now, we find that a useful theory. And for some time, we might, but we may need a new sieve, a new razor, a new tool for distinguishing between our plethora of theories before too long. If we can explain the bad bits without the assumption of an adapter, we must. It's just simpler. Stop making stuff up is basically the Occam thing. But again, it's not true. It's not proven untrue. It's just a theory that's more convoluted than the one we would need to explain things that we've seen. They both explain everything we've seen, though. They both pass the save appearances test. Okay. Again, we're studying the way the medievals thought by looking at their poetry. Should we have another simultaneous sip? I feel like we should. Um, yeah, hour and a half in. Let's keep going, baby. So grab your cup. Hold on. Your cup, your mug, your glass, your tankard, your chalice, your thermos or your stein, your canteen, jug, or flask, your vessel of any kind, and fill it with your favorite liquid. I'm going to drink water today. And join me now for the unparalleled pleasure, the dopamine hit of the day, the thing that makes everything better. I know you're looking forward to it. Everything better. It's called the simultaneous sip, and it happens right now. Go. I'm ready for another push. Whew, that's exciting. You feel the simultaneousness of it all, don't you? In every age, it will be apparent to accurate thinkers that scientific theories being arrived at in the way I have described are never statements of fact. Well, I just said all that. So great. Maybe I count as a thinker in an age that's being accurate, according to C.S. Lewis. That stars appear to move in such and such ways, or that substances behave thus and thus in the laboratory, these are statements of fact. Okay, this is important for you to know. We're living in a scientism age, and science is really powerful and awesome. Everybody who loves science and cares about science needs to be paying attention right now because you're in the scientism element of the way that we're thinking, and that's the water we're swimming in right now. Although that era is coming to an end and the water is draining fast. In the era we're in now, we need to understand exactly why science is so powerful and what counts as scientifically established truth. So that stars appear to move in such and such ways, that's a fact, scientific fact. To me, standing here, it appears to me the stars moving this way relative to this other thing. That's a scientific fact. Substances behave thus and thus in the laboratory. That's a scientific fact. The astronomical or chemical theory can never be more than provincial. Those facts don't prove gravity. They really don't. They don't even come close to it. Ask Newton, ask Galileo, ask Einstein. When they are pushed to that question, they all say the same thing. I'm not trying to answer that question. I'm trying to describe it accurately. My theory takes into account all the facts, is what they say. But we laymen think, oh, Galileo looked in his microscope and discovered the word gravity written on the subatomic particle. And of course, he didn't have a microscope like that. But you see what I'm saying? Like he looked through his telescope and he saw a far distant moon that said gravity, and he saw the waves of gravity. And it's like, no, science has facts, and then it has to have a story that accounts for all those facts, and then it has a bunch of them, and provisionally we pick which one is working best right now or which one is simplest. Well, both of those tests. But none of that is establishing truth. The stories that we're telling ourselves to make sense of all these facts are not established facts. They're theories that are really powerful. They're awesome. You can love them. You could be like, look at how sophisticated this theory is. It takes into account all of this plethora of biological difference and it explains it with these three simple principles and these few terms. This is awesome. Yes, it is. We're not binning that. We're not crumpling it up and throwing it out. What we're saying is, on a philosophical level, none of the scientists who know what they're doing would ever make the mistake of saying that the story they're using, the model that they're provincially using to make sense of things so far is established fact. And if any of them recognized more than one, and they all do, more than one story that takes into account and saves the appearances, as now we have that language available to us now that we've learned what it really meant. Um, any anybody who's well learned, who understands that there are multiple theories that do the same thing, doesn't think that you can distinguish between the two unless you find another fact that doesn't fit one of those theories. But so long as you have theories that explain all the facts, they're all at best, you have one that you provincially prefer for the time. That's as far as it goes. And all the serious scientists and philosophers all understood that. We laymen in our modern post Cartesian scientism age don't understand that. You need to learn that. You need to know that that's really true. The most advanced scientists, the best of the best of the best, they know that. That's how they can do their science. The way they can do their science is they know it's not, I've established the story is true. The facts are true. And the facts even have qualifiers like these stars appear. They appear to me from this standpoint. So there's even qualifiers on the facts, but we need to know that more generally. Okay, the astronomical or chemical theory is more provincial. It will have to be abandoned if a more ingenious person thinks of a supposal which would save the observed facts, but with still fewer assumptions. We'd have to give it up if we're sticking with Occam's razor then, or if we discovered new phenomena which don't fit into it at all. All right. This is our provincial best explanation so far. And scientists use those phrases. And when they use those phrases, often the layperson, so let's say you're watching a Nova special in the 1980s on dinosaurs and they're being depicted. I don't know if this would have happened in the 1980s, but let's do what C.S. Lewis is doing with the medieval minds and look at the layman's poetry. Let's say you're watching the Flintstones in the 60s or whenever that was on. You're watching these cartoons of dinosaurs, and where are they? They're running around in the desert. Why? Because we found their bones in the desert. They didn't live in the desert. They lived in swamplands and rainforests and aquatic environments. Obviously, look at the freaking tails. Has nobody pointed out the fact that they have crocodile tails because they're not walking around on land so much? Anyway, but the layman's understanding is, look, in the desert, we found these bones. There used to be dinosaurs here in this desert. Well, this here used to not be desert. It used to be far away on a different part of the globe, and it was quite warmer. And it's just we didn't know that. Okay, but forgetting the layman's perspective on that and how that's changing, imagine you were to watch, and I'll just make up an example without finding it, but these examples are everywhere. Imagine you're watching a Nova special where they're interviewing the scientist. Ooh, the scientist is about to tell us something. When you're sitting there and the scientist says, well, he's asked a question. What was life like for the T-Rex? And the scientist says, well, the best evidence we have so far suggests that the T-Rex could best be thought of as a land dwelling great white shark, essentially, a lone hunter that had very little social life. As soon as it was born, it very quickly moved away from the other creatures of its species and hunted alone. And the other creatures which lived in the Jurassic, or yeah, I think it was probably the Jurassic um, period, they would hesitate whilst walking past any branch or any tree because who knew what was behind, but this great hunter could be anywhere, and he's a lone hunter, so you don't even know that the flock is coming and the herd is upon you. Okay, fine. He's painting a picture and telling you a story, and he's using a phrase, the best evidence we have so far suggests. And often lay people, when they hear that, they think, whoa, the best evidence has proven this is the case. But what the scientist means when he says that, and what his peers understand him to mean, is sometimes, as in the case of the particle physicist, we are 99.99999% sure of this. But sometimes, in the case of the paleontologist, the expert who's speaking those words and his peers are understanding him to mean, who the hell frickin' knows? We only found one partial part of one fossilized nest. It seemed to suggest that there weren't a bunch of nests around each other, which is what we tend to see with highly social creatures. And so the best evidence we have so far suggests maybe it was like this. And then 15 years later, you hear the scientist on the Nova special asked the question, what was life like for a T Rex? He says, wow, 15 years ago, we thought something different, but now we've discovered more and new things have been discovered. And the best evidence we have so far suggests that the T Rex had a complex, sophisticated social life that permeated all aspects of his being, from hunting to nesting to reproduction and to finding prey and to doing this and that and blah, blah, blah. And that they worked together in teams. And the layperson might go, wait a minute, I watched the Nova special 15 years ago. You told me the opposite. Now you're telling me this. These scientists are just making things up and they don't know. But that's not really the right impression. And what would be helpful, listen up if you're a scientist, please. What would be very helpful for the public understanding of science would be if every scientist, from the particle physicist to the anthropologist to the paleontologist, were to give a confidence index on what they're saying, because you and your peers understand what the phrase the best evidence we have so far suggests, because you understand the quality of the evidence that you have in that field. But the second scientist interviewed 15 years later, they discovered more things and now it's pointing in a different direction. But the layperson sometimes thinks, you guys are just making stuff up. You used to tell me this. I thought that they lived in the desert. Now you're telling me they live in jungles. I thought the T Rex was a lone hunter. Now I think he's a social creature. Who knows what you'll say tomorrow? But that's because you're forgetting to tell them. It's the scientist's fault in the public understanding of science that this is a problem. When you're being interviewed by Nova and you're sitting there like, finally, someone gives a shit about what I'm studying, and you're all excited to be asked questions. Good for you. Spotlight on you, and this is your time. Please help out all of science by saying something like, the best evidence we have so far, and we have very little evidence. Who knows what we might discover on this question tomorrow? Now, maybe doing all of that won't help because the layman is still going to hear what they're going to hear about that. Well, like children, even if we're experts in law, but not in dinosaurs, we love to grab on to the knowledge that's coming from the adults, and you're the one that's studying that thing. So maybe there's no way around this. But if the general public understood the confidence index that should go on these things and paid attention to it, that would be a really good cultural development in our understanding of these things. I'm going to stop illustrating that and talking about it anymore, but we can talk about it another time. Like, what kind of confidence do you have? Here's how you might calculate it, scientists. Uh, the T Rex lived for 142 million years. I'm making up some numbers. And their generations were every other year. So there should be 296, whatever the number is. I forgot what the first number I said. 296 instances of nest laying events, time periods. And there were on average this many T Rexes that would have been reproducing and blah, blah, blah. So you got a pretty big number now, right? You got a huge number. And you say, I guess it would have been half, whatever. So you multiply how many nests could have ever existed that if I had discovered them and could study them, I would know something more. What percentage of those nests over the time span, because maybe the T-Rex changed over time, would I have to have access to have a confident answer to this? And then just divide the number of nests or partial nests that you have any access to at all by that number. That's your confidence index. 1 over 1,000, 1 over 2,000,000, right? It's a really small confidence index. And it's okay. You know that you're doing your job properly. Your peers know that you're doing your job properly. We understand, educated people in the field understand that the nature of the type of evidence that you have, and you're doing everything right. You're not lying, but a layperson might think you're lying because how can you change your mind that quickly? Well, we didn't really have any evidence to begin with, is really the answer. We had a little, and we looked at it right, and it pointed in this direction, but what if I discover another one that's pointing in the other direction that's in better quality and evidently doing so, I'm going to change my mind. So how easily could you discover something that would change your mind about what it is that you're reporting should be the idea of the confidence index. And I've tried talking about this with certain scientists who, well, scientists, people hired at the collapsing universities that don't deserve to call themselves institutes of higher learning any longer, but who get to call themselves professors in those silly institutions for now, who just cannot comprehend this concept. I tried explaining it to them. They're like, "Well, yeah, we use statistics." It's like, I know what statistically significant means. I'm talking about how you, without error and without creating unnecessary confusion, speak about your subject to people that are not in it. Anyway, that's a nice side note. The astronomical chemical theory is abandoned if it, all right, so there's ways we have to abandon it, of course. And that's a really important point. Just because people change their theories in science doesn't mean that they didn't know what they were talking about. They're working hard on stuff. Sometimes they have a ton of evidence and more than you would think you would need, and sometimes they only have a little. Even when they have a ton of evidence, those facts fit the story, but that doesn't prove the story because you can have multiple stories. And it turns out another fact could come in and tell you, oh, that more convoluted story that also took into account all the facts, that's the one you have to use. And so it's always provisionally that we're accepting our theories. Okay, this would, I believe, be recognized by all thoughtful scientists today. Yeah, thoughtful is the operative word. Should take away the word scientists from most of it. Anyway, it was recognized by Newton if, as I am told, he wrote, the attraction varies inversely as as the square of the distance, but all happens as if it so varied. The serious scientists, Galileo, Newton, Einstein, talking about gravity, they were very careful. They were posed these questions and they answered them. They said, "Oh yeah, don't make a mistake of thinking I've found gravity. I'm I'm finding good mathematics for describing the fact that bodies move towards each other." But all right, anyway, there's a sense in which found gravity and a sense in which not, and learned scientific minds understand it and philosophers of mind understand it. And it's our job to try to get everybody else to not hide that fact so they can feel like they know more than they do to other people and whatever. It was certainly recognized in the Middle Ages. In astronomy, says Aquinas, an account is given of eccentric and epicycles on the ground that, if their assumption is made, hoc positione facta, the sensible appearances as regards celestial motions can be saved. In other words, you don't have to ignore any phenomenal facts if you just assume this. It's that's great. But this is not a strict proof sufficienter probinus, since for all we know, forte, they could also be saved by some different assumption. So Aristotle understands this idea and the medievals understand this idea. The real reason why Copernicus raised no ripple and Galileo raised a storm may well be that whereas the one offered a new supposal about celestial motions, the other insisted on treating the supposal as fact. I've thought about that with Galileo. I'm not going to make any more comments about Galileo because reading him is fantastic and impressive, and we're going to have to do it at some point. I would guess a very small percentage of us are going to even be able to follow along. It's really something. But I was thinking this thought just the other day. Gosh, this is so interesting. Copernicus didn't raise a ripple, but Galileo did. And I was thinking to myself, maybe it makes sense that Galileo was shown the instruments of torture. I know that online people say, oh, yeah, look how dumb the religious are. But Galileo was, I'm going to have to reserve saying anything about it until we go and give Galileo his fair shake here and read it. By the way, he's unbelievably brilliant. I mean, unbelievably brilliant. But I was thinking it's so funny to read this, the synchronicity of the fact. I don't even know why I was thinking about it. Just the other day, I was thinking about this exact idea. Interesting. If so, the real revolution consisted not in a new theory of the heavens, but in a new theory of the nature of theory. 100% possibly true. We're gonna look into that in greater depth. Not here. It's not for the purpose of this class, but We're definitely going to look into that question. That's interesting. On the highest level, then, the model was recognized as provincial. I'm sorry, provisional. Provincial. Provisional. What we should like to know, also provincial, probably. What we should like to know is how far down the intellectual scale this cautious view extended. Okay, so let's see if the layman understood it through poetry. In our age, I think it would be fair to say that the ease with which a scientific theory assumes the dignity and rigidity of fact varies inversely with the individual's scientific education. This is everything I've been trying to say. The more you go around saying evolution's a fact, gravity's a fact, don't you know these things are facts? We've proven them. You know very little of science if that's the type of thing that you're saying. Scientists find theories like evolution and gravity really powerful, really awesome. Boy, do we like them. Boy, do we use them. The more education we have, the less likely we would ever refer to something as a fact. And you see it on Twitter all the time. There's people who even have scientist as their damn job title, which, by the way, 99% of people who get a job title of scientist have no idea how to think scientifically. There's a bunch of rules in the lab that force the product of their work to move sort of in that direction. But 50% of papers are shown not to be replicable within 1 year. So believe me, calling yourself a scientist doesn't mean you know anything about science. And the people who really know how to think scientifically, like Feynman, they would never talk about it that way. We'll talk about Feynman another time. In discussion with wholly uneducated audiences, I have sometimes found matter which real scientists would regard as highly speculative, more firmly believed than many things within our real knowledge. The popular imago of the caveman ranked as hard fact, and the life of Caesar or Napoleon as doubtful rumor. We must not, however, hastily assume that the situation was quite the same in the Middle Ages. So even though we think of ourselves as superior scientifically, it's only because we're actually maybe inferior scientifically. The more sophisticated you are in your understanding of science, you wouldn't talk about it the way the layperson talks about it today. And if the poetry of medieval times shows that the layperson thought about it in a more sophisticated way than we do, then they are more scientific than us in that way. We must not, however, hastily assume the same is true of the Middle Ages. The mass media, which have in our time created a popular scientism, oh, hey, look, we found a buddy to use that word with us. I love it. A caricature of the true sciences did not then exist. The ignorant were more aware of their ignorance than now. Then than now. I swear to God, I don't even know if I fully read this book, but I haven't read it in like 2.5 decades. But boy, oh boy, have we found a good source for everything we've been talking about. Yet I get the impression that when the poets use motives from the model, they are not aware, as Aquinas was, of its modest epistemological status. I do not mean that they have raised the question he raises and answers it differently. More probably, it has never been before in their minds. They would have felt that the responsibility for their cosmological or for their historical or religious beliefs rested on others. It was enough for them that they were following good aucteurs, great clerks, these old wise. Okay. So doesn't that sound like the opposite of the point he was making? I get the impression that when the poets use motives from the model, they are not aware, as Aquinas was, of its modest epistemological status. Okay, so he actually said we shouldn't take for granted that that's true in the Middle Ages. And then he says, but my studies show that it probably was. I mean, how could it be otherwise? How could it be otherwise that the person less educated in scientific thinking thinks it has a stronger epistemological status than it does than the person who's well educated in it? Okay, fine. Not only epistemologically, but also emotionally, the model probably meant less to the great thinkers than to the poets. This, I believe, must also be so in all ages. Well, how could that not be true, right? The poets are feeling more, right? That doesn't mean that the scientist has better understanding of his theories. The poet is feeling what they mean more while also being in error of exactly what they mean, the epistemological question. Quasi-religious responses to the I remember this thing, somebody was saying, I it might have been It might have been, I hate getting old and forgetting names, words, and things like that. Not William F. Buckley Jr. It was, father and son writing. They're both authors. Oh, for the love of mercy. Oh, for the love of mercy. I hate having brain farts. Um, Kingsley Amos and Martin. It might have been Martin Amos. It might have been Martin Amos who said, and I could be misquoting, misattributing. And people talk about all this scientific development. It could have been Ray Bradbury for that matter. Anyway, all this scientific development. Oh no, we're entering an age of science. Where's our poetry going to reside? How are we going to have any literature? And he took this example. He said, okay, so you're telling me that if I thought of the sun as a bunch of burning wood somewhere, I would be, and then I changed my understanding to understand that it was nuclear explosions feeding the earth like a giant nuclear reactor times billion, nuclear bombs going off just to power all of the biology on the surface of the earth, that I would be uninspired by that, right? So, this is a very interesting relationship here. I should probably find that quote and do a better job, but by just citing it or reading it. But in any event, what he's talking about here is that okay, we have the well-learned people who have their scientific theories and models for making sense of everything, and then we have the poetic and layman understanding of all of that, which tends to overestimate its epistemological status and not understand that it's theories and we have a plethora of them and it's the ones that haven't been disproven so far and this is the simplest one we've found but we don't have any reason beyond the the provisional. We have no reason beyond the provisional to be accepting this one, but Occam's razor tells us to, so we go with that. Instead, they think, the scientists now know this is the way it works. Is this story surrounding all the facts that they know? Not only that, but of course, that's true in both ages, but of course, also, the poets are feeling more, and they're seeing the meaning of the story and having the impact reverberate with them as they write about what it's like to struggle against things and talk about slaying dragons and all of this stuff. So why wouldn't that also be the same in their age? Quasi-religious responses to the hypostatized abstraction life are to be sought in Shaw and Wells, or in a highly poetical philosopher such as Bergson, not in the papers. Sometimes you get overlap. There's certain scientific minds that are philosophical, like Darwin. There are certain scientific minds that are also beyond philosophical, poetic. Um, There was an essay called "An Essay in Geopoetry," which matters to us geologists, and the essay argued not that the Earth worked a certain way, but isn't it beautiful how it looks as though it works that way? And of course, it did work that way, but we didn't have the proof of it, so he couldn't get published for saying it does work that way because there were physical problems with saying it does work that way. But it turns out it does work that way, but he couldn't say that without being laughed out of academia. So he wrote an essay in geopoetry where he talked about, isn't it amazing that it looks like that anyway? In any event, there are scientists who have poetic feeling. It's very rare to be a scientist, and of course, rare to have poetic feeling at the same time. Feynman was one. I mean, for goodness sake, he learned how to play the drums and then wrote a percussion opera with a friend of his that came in second in a global contest that year. Just because, hey, he can do that. He traveled to South America to meet with an artist painter because you can see Feynman's early sketchings are worse than what I would draw, and I'm terrible. But then he becomes a painter because he says, "I'll come down and teach you physics, and then we'll visit each other. And one day I'll teach you physics. The next day you teach me how to paint." And it'll be Michelangelo together, the 2 of us, because 'cause I'm a scientist and you're a painter. Let's merge, and he built a friendship that way, and anyway, Feynman was something else for sure, really. We've had classes on him in our the great trolls of history class. We spent some time on Feynman. He had a great sense of humor too. But back to this. What C.S. Lewis is talking about here is that the poets are overestimating the epistemological status of the greatest theories that are being developed at the time, then and now, but they're also feeling more about what they mean and helping to express to people who are also resonating with the fact that it has that poetic meaning to the characters that we are in the world as we use the theories to try to conceptualize our place in the cosmos. All of that seems legitimate. That's academic too. That matters too. That's needed as well. Okay, not in the papers and lectures of biologists, obviously. Delight in the medieval model is expressed by Dante, Jean de Meung, rather than by Albertus and Aquinas. The joy of it all. Isn't this amazing? Partly, no doubt, this is because expression of whatever emotion is not the business of philosophers. But I suspect this is not the whole story. It is not in the nature of that great thinkers should take much interest in models. They have more difficult and more controversial matters in hand. Every model is a construct of answered questions. The expert is engaged either in raising new questions or in giving new answers to old ones. When he's doing the first, the old agreed model is of no interest to him. When he is doing the second, it is beginning an operation which will finally destroy the old model altogether. One particular class of experts, the great spiritual writers, ignore the model almost completely. We need to know something about the model if we are to read Chaucer, but we can neglect it if we are reading St. Bernard or The Scale of Perfection or The Imitation. So, mystical writings as well might ignore the old model, and that's not inappropriate, right? There's a plethora of disciplines. Why don't I do this? There is I'm gonna pull this up right now. We have a subject map of all the subjects from welding to carpentry to ethics to Catholic catechism studies to psychedelic drug taking, which we do not endorse or do here. All right, so we have a relationship between all of the subjects. Let's see, is this even visible? Yeah, okay. We're working on hopefully making an interactive map of this. But each one of these divides and divides and divides and divides. These are lots of different ways of trying to understand the answer to the question, what does it mean to be human? And the whole sum total is the humanities, but you split it into the mythos and the logos. You split the logos into philosophy and science, the psychologos and philologos. And it goes down to biochemistry and bioinformatics. And, it's just every type of subject that you can imagine is in the map. Let's get rid of that. That's not the full map, of course. Every sport is in it and all in relationship to each other, different types of group sports and individual sports and sports that have to do with you versus the world versus you throwing a projectile and whether or not the projectile has to hit a target or go a distance. Like all of the sports are in there, every single discipline. The point is, they're all legitimate ways of trying to reach transcendence and of trying to, I'm being careful with my words, of trying to achieve transcendence, of pointing towards an ultimate truth, of sophisticating, educating, and developing yourself. And C.S. Lewis is saying, yeah, there's this science thing. Isn't that great? How is that affecting these other completely legitimate disciplines like literature? And it turns out there's different types of literature. And if you're doing mysticism, you can just sort of ignore it, he says. If you're doing other types of literature, it's very important that you speak in a way that resonates with the model that the layman has of the cosmos, which is, of course, affected by the two-way conversation between the experts in philosophy and science and those lay people, and between the philosophers and the scientists, and between the philosophers and the theologians and the scientists and the theologians. All of these different things are fine. We're going to do literature here. While we're doing literature, let's examine the influence of the greatest scientific theories and the quality that they are believed to have to be had by the experts in those theories and the quality that of epistemological quality that they're believed to have by the layperson and by the poet speaking to them, and about the feeling that it creates in those persons in that culture when they conceptualize themselves in the cosmos in those ways. So once again, from the beginning, we said there are two subjects that are going to be looked at here: astrophysics as distinct from cosmology. That the medievals, that C.S. Lewis understands this, but he says that the medievals understand this. As we've seen in our previous classes, Aristotle understood the earth was round. Aquinas understood the earth was round. Every learned person who was reading and caring about their books, which was everybody in the Middle Ages and the scholastic camp at least, knew all of that. They also had a cosmology. What the heck is that? That's a different thing. Like history versus literature. This is a story to tell you about your place in the world. This is stories. They don't have to be connected to the facts in the same way. There's different relationship between the facts. You're telling me a story here with evidence that that story is a thing that actually happened to a person who existed in a place that actually was. Over here in literature, you're just telling me stories, but I'm still getting insights into what it means to be human that way. Likewise, astrophysics is telling you, here's who you are in relationship to the cosmos. Let's you're an insignificant bit of dust on a speck on a speck on a speck on a speck of dust in a giant, vast, exploding, expanding universe. Okay, you can think of it that way. Another way you could think of those exact same set of facts is it takes a billion times the scope outside what you are to create enough stuff that can compete with the number of connections in your neurons because your consciousness is that powerful. So these facts don't really tell you your place in the cosmos. Cosmology is a wrestling of different types of stories of ways of interpreting those scientific theories and those facts. Scientific theories are just saying this is the simplest formula wherein you can take any amount of data, put it in, and get a prediction for the other data, but it's probabilistic and it's formulaic, and we actually have a plethora of explanations, but this is the simplest one for now. And all of the ones that we even consider at least take into account everything that we know in our data. Great. Fantastic. Keep doing that. That's going to help us to understand our place in the world and what it means to be human, the human condition, the humanities. Science is within that, actually. It really is. On another level, it is because it's a psychological way of questioning how sophisticated the intellectual structures of the mind, mathematically or otherwise, can be to make sense of nearly chaotic, ginormous, combinatorial plethora of data in geology or physics or any other subject. So it's very much in the humanities in more than one way. But thank you for the progress you're making there, but that's not the same as cosmology. And if we in our scientism age don't even understand this distinction, then the medievals, if they did, they have access to a distinction that is makes their intellectual life much richer than ours because our scientists are doing cosmology at the same time and nobody's noticing that they're not really the authorities on the final way to interpret the story and what it means. Some of them might be very good at it, but it's very rare to be good at both. Anyway, let's continue. We see where this is all going. Oh, we need to know something that models. All right. This is partly because the spiritual books are entirely practical, not medical books or like medical books. Okay. So there's spiritual books that are mysticism and disciplines, and there's practical religious studies that say, okay, if you go through this mental exercise, you can maybe induce within yourself or at least clear away the intellectual cognitive clutter that would stop you from having a direct experience with the divine. Or here's a way that you can have a system of fasting and praying that might lead to something practical through your spiritual life or something like that. That's fine. That's like medicine. It's like, here, do follow this exercise regimen, eat this kind of diet. The point of it isn't a fact about the cosmos, except that you can live it out and say, hey, that's working for me or it's not working for me. That's where the test actually is. It doesn't happen before. And he's just saying that fits into that category. That's not the same as some of the other literature, which definitely depends on the concepts that you're using to model yourself and your place in the world. In a not primarily practical way. Okay, but as is service to the poetic. Okay, a man concerned about the state of his soul will not usually be much helped by thinking about the spheres or the structure of the atoms. Not usually, but perhaps there was in the Middle Ages another factor also at work. Their cosmology and their religion were not such easy bedfellows as might be supposed. At first, we may fail to notice this, for the cosmology appears to us in its firmly theistic basis, and it's ready welcome to the supernatural to be eminently religious. That's how we read it. We're like, "Oh, look how religious these people were. They thought God was here, and then there were these 7 domes of influence from most perfect down to most complicated." We're gonna get into the cosmology of the medievals. They had this view of a disk-like Earth with all these domes on top of regions of authority. They also understood the Earth was round, and that if you traveled through the middle of it, you'd come out the other side and things would be upside down. Like, they understood the physics of it, and they had a cosmology, and it didn't matter that those 2 things weren't lining up, like, they weren't taking this one as a list of facts about the physical way it is. They were saying, "This is the story that makes the most sense out of the way you see yourself in the cosmos." And maybe it does, or maybe it did very well. And in any event, um they still had their physics, and their physics wasn't wrong. And we do the same thing, it's just we're pretending that we're not. And so we're not doing cosmology well because we're just sort of leaving it to a few scientists to tell us what they think it means. Some of them are pretty impressive, but most of it's utter nonsense, as you would expect it to be. At first, we may fail to notice this. All right. So we read it as, oh, look how religious they were. It turns out maybe it was actually really hard to make harmony of all of these Aristotelian facts about the cosmos and how I view my relationship with God. And maybe it was really quite tricky to not lose anything that was true in either of those, according to the medieval mind, and create a model that was harmonious. And maybe there was more tension in their mind between the two. And we think it's just, they were religious. So they imagined God was out there somewhere. And so in one sense it is, but it is not eminently Christian. The pagan elements embedded in it, remember they want to harmonize all of this. Anything that comes from a book basically is his view of the way the medieval mind is working. Involved a conception of God and of man's place in the universe, which, if not in logical contradiction to Christianity, were subtly out of harmony with it. There was no direct conflict between religion and science of the 19th century type, but there was an incompatibility of temperament. Delighted contemplation of the model and intense religious feeling of a specifically Christian character are seldom fused except in the work of Dante. It's an exception, that proving an opposite rule, perhaps. One difference between describing the model and writing a history of thought has been undesignedly illustrated in the previous chapter. I there cited both Plato and Aristotle. Oh boy, some tension, you think? But the role I had to give them was philosophically humiliating. The one called as witness to a scrap of demonology, the other for some exploded physics. Naturally, I was not suggesting that their real and permanent place in the history of Western thought rested on such foundations. Remember, there are neo Aristotelians today who don't think his physics has exploded, by the way, but we'll set that aside. Also, uh, I'm more inclined to appreciate the Platonic than the Aristotelian. So they concerned us less as great thinkers than as contributors, indirect, unconscious, and almost accidental contributors to the model, capital M, the model of the medievals. That's what we're going to study here so we can understand their literature, and we're going to understand that model through their literature. The history of thought, as such, would deal chiefly with the influence of great experts upon great experts, the influence not of Aristotle's physics, but of his ethics and his dialectical method on those of Aquinas. But the model is built out of the real or supposed agreement of any ancient authors, good or bad, philosophers or poets, understood or misunderstood, who happen, for whatever reason, to be available. Remember, his model of medieval culture is not that it sprung out of the ground autochthonously. It's not that it sprung out of the ground autochthonously and then became a highly developed, undisturbed culture that eventually developed its philosophy and its science and everything else. His model is something more like this cartoon version where you just take 250,000 people, throw them onto a continent, and leave 8 libraries there from 8 different sources, and all of those people regard the books as somehow authoritative, and they have a very hard time thinking something's not true if it was written down a long time ago. And now they're trying to make sense of all those pieces and put them into a harmonious model where you can accept it all and it's all okay and there's no contradictions. You say that's sort of their intellectual project. These explanations will perhaps set at rest or redirect one doubt which a prospective reader might possibly feel on first dipping here and there into this book. I can imagine such a preliminary renaissance leading to the question, but how far down the intellectual scale did this model of yours penetrate? Well, it seems like it half originated as a grassroots process, is what he's saying. It's both top down and bottom up. Are you not offering us the background for literature, things which were really known only to a few experts? It will now be seen, I hope, that the question how far up the real potency of the model was operative is at least equally pertinent, right? The experts on on Aristotle, they kind of know what they think and why and how, and they might even go, that poetry and whatever. This model of trying to make sense of it all is maybe grassroots primarily, or at least just as equally bottom up as top down. Hmm. There was no doubt a level below the influence of the model. Certainly there were people who were not very well learned or illiterate or brutish, and they did their thing and they barely were affected by the stories of their culture and the people around them, which are all informed by these things. There were ditchers and alewives who had not heard of the primum mobile, the prime mover, and did not know that the earth was spherical. Sure, there's ignorant people everywhere, not because they thought it was flat, but because they didn't think about it at all. Nevertheless, elements from the model appear in such a homily of and art in such a homely and artless compilation as the South English Legendary. Okay, everyday people who can read at all are totally thinking in this way, he says. That's the model I'm after, is how they're all thinking. And believe me, this stuff was permeating from the top down and from the bottom up. On the other hand, as I have tried to indicate, there were certain levels, both intellectual and spiritual, which were in a sense above the model's full power. Sure, you could be Aquinian and therefore Aristotelian and kind of you still want to make sense of everything and put it all together, but maybe you find it easier to dismiss a bit of writing that you regard as false. Whereas the culture as a whole is trying to say, "Well, I read this. I read this somewhere. How does that fit in?" And a lot of what Aquinas is doing is trying to figure out how everything fits in. But, there's probably layers where you just say, "Okay, I don't need I got this is the thing, and I don't need to worry about what some pagan wrote about spirits flying through the air or whatever." I say in a sense because these metaphors are above and below might otherwise carry a false suggestion. It might be supposed that I believe science and philosophy to be somehow intrinsically valuable than literature and art. I hold no such view. The higher intellectual level is higher only by one particular standard. By another standard, the poetic level is higher. I've made arguments maybe different from the one he's going to make, maybe the same to that point quite a lot in other places, so I won't go off on it now. Comparative evaluations of essentially different excellences are, in my opinion, senseless. Comparative if your point is to dismiss of one of them, I think finding out anyway, the discussion seems worth it, and he's been doing a lot of it. A surgeon is better than a violinist at operating, and a violinist is better than a surgeon at playing violin. Okay, tell me which one's more valuable to society. That conversation might be stupid, right? Let's have good surgeons and have good violinists. How about that? And let's appreciate the value that they both bring. And I don't know why you're going to argue that, well, the violinist is more powerful because you could keep me alive forever as the excellent, most perfect surgeon. But if I have nothing to live for, why are you doing it? Right. Or you could say, well, clearly the scientist who can operate on you and save your life is more powerful. If you fell and you got a disease, you wouldn't want to have a violinist around playing violin. It's like that seems like a really dumb conversation, is what C.S. Lewis is saying. Both are means of transcendence. Both are attempts to get to better understanding, make a better world, make the world, a more harmonious and fruitful and better place, have more goodness in it. Okay, achieve transcendence. You have to be quite disciplined. There's quite a lot of art to being a good surgeon. Um, anyway, we'll move on from comparing and contrasting two things that C.S. Lewis says, "What a waste of time to compare and contrast." Nor am I at all suggesting that the poets and artists are wrong or stupid in omitting from their backcloth much which the experts think important. An artist needs some anatomy. He need not go on to physiology, much less so to biochemistry. And if these scientists change much more than anatomy changes, his work will not reflect their progress. Okay. So that's a good point, right? The artists are using concepts from this scientific and Aristotelian and philosophical and these sophisticated scholastic thinkers. They're using them because the general public has some idea of them and because their poetry resonates when they're using these ideas. But also, they're using the ones that apply to the things that are meaningful to those people because that their art is about in the first place. And so I mean, C.S. Lewis has done a heck of a job setting up the study that we're about to do. And the study that we're about to do is to look at the poetry of medieval and Renaissance to understand the model that the layperson had of the cosmos. And he's done a heck of a job setting that up so far and saying, here's how that model originated, here's the type of culture it was, here's what they were trying to do to integrate and harmonize all these various sources. And here's why they maybe felt compelled to do that. And blah blah blah. Okay, so let's pause there. Maybe we'll end and later today we'll read the rest of this book. Let's see if we can yeah, all right. Well, maybe we'll read more of this book later today. Um, but I think it'd be a good time to end and probably within half an hour I'll start another live stream.